Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Joseph Glore, your host for today, and the Assistant Content Director here at Word on Fire. I'm so happy to be here with all of our listeners, and of course, with our faithful magister, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, thanks for coming down to the studio today.
Good to be with you, Joe. I like to be a magister.
Yes, well, you're an excellent one, and we're just always blessed to have you down here. You know, if you've been listening and following along for the past few weeks, you know that we've been focusing on episodes of Bishop Barron's new epic film series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Players, which can actually be ordered right now. So I recommend you go down to pivotalplayers.com and buy it. And listen, for a super limited time, we're also giving a special $10 coupon to Word on Fire show listeners. So when you check out, use the promo code SISTINE4. It's not 16, it's Sistine, S-I-S-T-I-N-E, the number 4. And there's your clue also about today's pivotal player for the episode. But before we get to him, let's find out what's been going on with you, Bishop Barron. A lot, I understand.
Yeah, of course, I have my Word on Fire responsibilities and speaking and evangelizing, but my basic job is to be the regional bishop here in Santa Barbara. So I've been doing a lot of, pastoral work, which I enjoy very much. So, for example, just a couple of days ago, I was visiting some of the elderly and infirm priests and deacons in the region. And I came to this wonderful nursing facility in Newbury Park, which is about halfway between Santa Barbara and L.A. And I was there to see 3 priests, and I didn't realize, honestly, that this wonderful community called the Sisters Servants of Mary staff that place, take care of it. And out of the woodwork came about 15 beautiful nuns in these white habits. And they just surrounded me. And you sense their love and their devotion, and they take care of people who are really in bad shape, And God bless them. It was a thrill to visit them and see the work they do. Also, what about a week ago now, I threw out the first pitch at the Dodgers game, along with Bishop Joe Brennan, who was ordained along with me a year ago. And that was a thrill. I'm a Cub fan by background. I had 40 years of rooting for the Cubs, but now I'm out here in LA, so I had my Dodgers jersey and cap on, and very happily threw out the first pitch. So that was fun. And maybe 2 weeks ago, I was at the Todd Road Jail in Ventura. So I'd done a little bit of jail ministry when I was home in Chicago, and there's something really special about that. And I visited with about 5 or 6 inmates there, and prayed for them, talked to them, urge everybody listening to remember them. The people that are often just below our radar screen. We don't even think about those who are in prisons, those who are in nursing homes and hospice care and so on. So remember all these kind of often forgotten people that need the Lord's love and mercy. So anyway, I've been doing just a lot of different things, interesting things, and enjoying that pastoral side of life.
Yeah, it sounds certainly like you've had your hands full. And I remember Archbishop Gomez said, to make sure you're present to the people. Well, yeah, it sounds like you have been these past few weeks.
Yeah, and honestly, I think of that a lot. As I mentioned, he said that was your first responsibility as regional bishop, is be present to the people. And that's my basic job. And so, yeah, I'm trying to get around the region and to all the kind of nooks and crannies of the region to be present to the people. So pray for me, please.
Wonderful, absolutely. And today, like I said, we're going to be focusing on a pivotal player. And the pivotal players for today's episode is none other than the legendary Michelangelo Buonarroti. How's my Italian there? Not bad.
Not bad.
Now, one thing I learned from you is that in order to appreciate Michelangelo and his contributions to the Catholic tradition, we must first appreciate the efforts of an ancient monk. Can you explain this monastic connection?
Yeah, John of Damascus, or John Damascene, he's called sometimes. Thomas Aquinas cites him a lot, by the way, in his work. But John of Damascus was a key player in the so-called iconoclast controversy back in the early days of the 8th century. And, in a nutshell, it was a battle between those who felt that icons or pictures, representations were idolatrous and should be destroyed. And that's a very ancient religious instinct, that anything that distracts you from the pure otherness of God is a problem. But then there were people like John of Damascus who were iconophiles. They loved icons. And the argument basically was that God in Christ made an icon of himself. So Paul refers to Jesus as the icon of the invisible God. Well, if that's true, then why can't we make things that participate in the incarnation, namely pictures, representations of holy things? And there's that whole theology, that goes along with that, which tells us not to dwell so much on the surface of the icon, but to go through it to the heavenly reality which it depicts. Okay, that's an ancient battle. But see, my argument is, without John of Damascus, you can't imagine the whole tradition of Christian iconography. And by extension, the whole tradition of Christian art, architecture, using the physical, the beautiful to represent sacred things. And therefore, it's no exaggeration to say, without John of Damascus, there's no Chartres Cathedral. Without John of Damascus, there's no Sainte-Chapelle and stained glass windows. And there's no Sistine Chapel. There's no David. There's no Pietà. So I think the condition for the possibility of Michelangelo was this ancient figure, John of Damascus. So in the series, we begin the Michelangelo episode in Ravenna, and this great representation of the iconic tradition, because he's the condition for the possibility of Michelangelo.
Well, how about a little bit of information about Michelangelo himself? So, yeah, John of Damascus is kind of the precursor to this great figure, but now that people are creating icons and they're doing this for a few hundred years, we've got Michelangelo.
Yeah, and of course he's in many ways the culmination of what they call the High Renaissance. And so a tradition within European art, beginning with figures like Giotto and even before Giotto, comes to a sort of culmination with Michelangelo. He himself was born 1475, so toward the end of the 15th century. He's a Florentine, the way Dante was. So Florence was his town, and Florence, as you know, is just, with those two figures in mind, Dante and Michelangelo,
totally,
is just a city that gave rise to an artistic sensibility. As a kid, he's brought into the sculpture garden that was sponsored by Lorenzo de' Medici, who for a short time was the political leader of Florence and a guy with a great artistic sensitivity. So Michelangelo, as a young man, was formed as an artist, but also formed philosophically, because in that circle around Lorenzo, you had people like Pico della Mirandola, and you had others who were part of this Neoplatonic philosophical revival, a poetic revival. Dante was very important for them. So he's formed both artistically and intellectually, spiritually by this circle. It ended quickly. Lorenzo dies, and then there's a upheaval in Florence. Michelangelo makes his way eventually to Rome, and there he bursts on the scene with the Pietà. So it's a work of his extreme youth, really. He's only 20-something when he does it. And then that led him back to Florence, where he worked on the David. And with that, his reputation, primarily as a sculptor, is really confirmed. One of the turning points in his life was when Pope Julius II, for whom he was working on a tomb that would include, they think, upwards of 50 major sculpted figures.
Wow.
So it would be a life's work. But Julius redirected his attention to decorating the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which famously Michelangelo didn't want to do, felt it wasn't his métier at all. But thank God for Julius, because he forced the issue, and Michelangelo does that. And then, of course, by that time, he's emerged as perhaps the key player, along with Leonardo, and then the younger Raphael comes along, and those three really sum up the Italian High Renaissance. Michelangelo lives to be a very old man, dies in 1564, curiously the same year Shakespeare is born. And I've always found that moving to think of these two geniuses kind of succeeding each other. But, the thing I think is most important with Michelangelo is his Christianity. So the subject matter of the greatest artist in the Western tradition is almost exclusively the Christian religion, just as the subject matter of the greatest poet in the Western tradition, namely Dante, is almost exclusively Christianity.
Right.
See, I think we Christians ought to revel in that. We ought to claim that and say these consummate artists worked on our stuff. They worked on the Christian thing. And that's worth meditating. And I wanted to bring that dimension forward in the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you asked even a Christian person, name three things about Michelangelo that define Michelangelo, they might not even name Christian as one of them, whereas that was, for him, the priority of his life.
Yes, and I think that's the great correction that I wanted to make. People might say, oh, the great, the High Renaissance, this beautiful depictor of human anatomy, et cetera, et cetera. But Christian theologian, which I think is the right way to read Michelangelo.
We'll find out a lot about his theology as we go through some of these major works that he's created, both sculptures and paintings, and have you share some of our kind of lesser-known ideas about them that we see in the episode. And what makes the pivotal players a must-have in somebody's library is that you're going to hear about all of these great works of art, but what I saw when I watched the series was the most beautiful cinematography, imagery. We actually have the greatest library of Michelangelo's images on film. Word on Fire now from all the filming we've done of all these pieces. So you have to get the DVD to see the works of art, but now hopefully we'll be able to tickle your ears with some beautiful descriptions, starting with Michelangelo's Pietà. Tell us about that, with the name.
Yeah, Pietà in Italian just has that sense of pity, empathy. And so it's this scene that had become classic in Western art by Michelangelo's time, which was to depict Mary holding the body of crucified Jesus after the crucifixion. And so it's meant to awaken, to evoke the deepest feelings of sorrow and sympathy and so on, hence Pietà. Michelangelo did it as a very young man, as I say, and it was done as an altarpiece. So it was meant to be right on top of, right over an altar where Mass was being said. And I think that's the first interpretive key to it. What you have is, because everyone knows that image probably, Michelangelo's Pietà, Mary holding the crucified body of Jesus, but her left hand is stretched out, as it were indicating or offering. Well, see, what's the Mass, which would have taken place right there where the statue was supposed to be, but an offering of the body of Jesus, the crucified Lord, to the world. So there's Mary in that attitude. And then beautifully, her right hand is supporting the body of the Lord, but there's a bit of drapery in between her hand and the body of Jesus, so she's not directly touching him. In fact, she doesn't directly touch his body at any point. There's always, clothing in between or something. Well, that's a Eucharistic idea, isn't it? Because at the benediction, which would have happened in an altar, the priest will lift up the monstrance, but the priest always holds the monstrance through a humeral veil, it's called, which is meant to just show the reverence we have for the body of Jesus. And so both the moves of her hands, if you want, are Eucharistic references. I think of the great Wendy Beckett, Sister Wendy Beckett, who explored some of these pieces years ago, and she said, you look at the figures there, and it's this miracle of composition because, what's being portrayed is the body of an adult male on the lap of a woman. Well, it looks so natural the way Michelangelo does it, but think about that for a second. What a kind of strange, awkward position that is. Well, as Wendy Beckett said famously, it's as though Mary's body is like a great mountain and Jesus' body is like a river running down it, which I think is really beautiful.
That's lovely.
But what it catches too is the fact that she contains him. She's like a receptacle, like a container for his body. In fact, if you take the two figures and you stood them up, Mary would be much bigger than Jesus. Like she contains him. Now, what's that idea? That's also an old biblical and patristic idea that Mary is the true Ark of the Covenant, right? So the Ark of the Covenant is this container for the remnants of the Ten Commandments, and it was the sign of Yahweh's presence among his people. Well, the church fathers saw very early on the true Ark of the Covenant is Mary because she contains within her womb the very presence of God. And so there she is now, a Eucharistic figure offering the body of Jesus, and also the Ark of the Covenant, containing, if you want, the body of Jesus. I think both those motifs are implicit in the Pietà.
Another thing I should mention, for people who are listening, go to pivotalplayers.com because you can also see the trailer, the specific trailer for the Michelangelo episode, and you can see some of these things that the bishops mentioned here. It really is in glorious detail in that clip. Let's move on to his most famous sculpture, the David. First off, I understand you were given private access to the David for filming. So what was it like standing in a room with a masterpiece that we all know so well? And of course, tell us the biblical significance and deeper meanings of the work.
Yeah, well, it was a thrill to be there. We got in, it was like a day off when tourists were not allowed in. So we got in at, 9 o'clock in the morning. And it was a thrill. Just our crew in this, beautiful space, the Academia, where the David's on display. And as everyone says, and I knew this in advance, because it was the first time I'd seen it live. I had tried a couple times before in my life. It was too crowded or whatever. So the first time I had actually seen the David. And even though I knew it's much bigger than you think, still it's stunning when you come in. And you see the sheer size of it. And then you realize that Michelangelo carved it out of this sort of misshapen stone that had foiled the efforts of many sculptors before him. And he said, I'll do it, And so he renders from that stone this arguably the most famous sculpture in the world. So yeah, it was overwhelming just to be in the room with it and to be able to walk around it and really contemplate it for a long time.
Father Steve said it looked like it was going to just walk off the platform,
right.
which I don't get from an image. I mean,
No.
I don't get that sense from an image. But he said you look like it's going to start breathing and just walk off the platform.
Yeah, and the tensive quality of the body, where it's not just dumbly there, but it's this vibrantly alive figure. And of course, he's catching him at that moment of both extreme physical tensiveness, but also psychological tensiveness. He's about to make the move against Goliath, and so it's someone who's like an animal about to pounce, into action. But not just physically, but you get the intellectual and psychological power in the concentration of the face, But what I think is most interesting and is never emphasized sufficiently, Michelangelo is consistently a Christian theologian. That's what he's interested in. Now, if you say David to a biblical person, what comes to mind? Well, David is the paradigmatic king of Israel. And he's a prototype of Christ. Christ is the new David. Christ is the son of David. In the Gospel of Matthew, we have the 14 generations, the 3 sets of 14 that precede Jesus. And David's central there. But also 14 is the number that corresponds in Hebrew to the word Dawid. So every letter has a numeric value in Hebrew. So 14 is David. So what's Matthew saying with the 3 sets of 14? He's saying, David, David, David. Jesus is born in the city of David, Bethlehem. He's greeted frequently as the son of David. And so a biblical person, a Christian imagination, looking at David is thinking, okay, Christ, a prototype of Christ. So now in the beauty of David, and everyone will notice it, you can't miss it. And you'll say, it's the height of the Renaissance, it's a celebration of humanity, it's Renaissance humanism at its finest. Yes, I'll say yes to all of that. But don't forget, you're not just looking at a beautiful human body. What you're looking at is Christ knew David, Christ knew Adam, right? Now, see, go from Christ to David to Adam, because David was seen in many ways as a recapitulation of Adam. Adam is the proper king of the Garden of Eden. The fall is a kind of loss of kingly authority and power because he was a bad king. He allowed wickedness to come into his kingdom. And he wasn't able to fulfill his mission now to Edenize the world. Israel now has a long history of a quest for a king, for a new Adam. David, But then David, we know, is not perfect. David, we know, is also a flawed, fallen character. And so people begin to wait for the definitive David. That's Jesus, also called by Paul, New Adam. See, so that connection I want to make, and Michelangelo's making it, from Jesus to David to Adam, I think all that is summed up in the stunning beauty of this figure who is humanity restored, right? Christianity is not a Platonic system. Its purpose is not, let's get the soul away from the body. Its purpose is to save the whole person. And so the salvation wrought in Jesus has a psychological, intellectual, spiritual dimension and a physical dimension.
Sure.
And so when you look at David, you're meant to see, well, not just this historical figure, King David, or not just Michelangelo's rendition of perfect Renaissance humanism. You're meant to see a transfigured and restored humanity. The new Adam, the new David, Christ risen from the dead. I think that's going on there. And then another thing too, the nudity of David. So many people will comment, of course, and it was even in its time kind of shocking the way Michelangelo with such frankness depicts the nude figure of David. But see, for a Christian, if David is a prototype of Christ, Christ is the new David. Where do we see the nudity of Jesus? You see it precisely on the cross, the moment when Jesus goes forth as a warrior. See? Well, David, Michelangelo depicts him nude, going into battle against Goliath, meaning undefended, relying solely upon the power of God. See? Well, in a very similar way, Jesus goes forth naked into battle against the powers of sin and darkness and death, relying only on the power of his Father, right? And so in the nudity of David, about to enter into warfare with Goliath, you're meant to see an anticipation of the nudity of Jesus as he goes undefended into battle. I think that too is implied.
Well, and Adam before the fall, right?
Yes.
Because of the shame, then he covers himself.
Right. And so I think all those motifs are in the mix. But see, I find it, in all my years of studying Michelangelo, reading about him, that dimension is not brought forward.
No, I haven't heard it.
But he's a Christian theologian, first and foremost.
Tell us about the Sistine Chapel. There's so much going on there. I'd like to spend the most time with this one. So give us the inside scoop about some of the marvelous details.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to get at it is to maybe go from inside out. So the central panels, there are 9 of them, central scenes. They're scenes from the book of Genesis. And they're about creation, the creation of the cosmos. And then most famously, the creation of Adam, and then the creation of Eve. But then we see images of the fall. So Adam and Eve expelled from the garden. And then the limit, if you want, of the fall, which is the story of Noah and the destruction of the earth. And then the last scene, it's very interesting, the drunkenness of Noah, which shows, if you want, the dissolution, the falling apart of a once integrated humanity. So what Michelangelo is showing on the ceiling is creation in all of its beauty and goodness, but then the fall, which called forth a Savior. See? So remember the idea of Felix Culpa. What a happy fall that called forth such a Savior. Now we understand, as you go out from the central scenes, and you come to these great sibyls and prophets. So both Hebrew figures, Israelite figures, and, if you want, secular figures, all of whom are predicting the arrival of the Savior. Now go out to the next level of the Sistine composition, and you find the ancestors of Jesus mentioned in the Old Testament. Now you understand the whole ceiling is about Christ. It's about the reason why Christ was called forth, and then all the people that spiritually and physically anticipated him. Now, with that in mind, let's zoom in again. So we've gone from the central panels now out. Let's zoom in on the panel that's best known. Arguably the best known work of art in the world, namely the creation of Adam. So everybody knows the central image of God the Father. And what I love there is how dynamic he is. God the Father is like literally flying through the air because his robes are moving, his beard and hair are kind of flying, and he's got the finger extended outward. But he gives that sense of what Thomas Aquinas called actus purus. Right? God is pure act. And actus is from the Greek there. Actus is the Latin rendering of energeia in Greek. God is pure energy, right? The dynamism of to be. So there's the creator God. Now, in front of him is this figure of Adam, who is also a perfect physical specimen, meant to evoke, in some ways, the David, right? So there's from Christ to David to Adam, so humanity at its finest. But he's recumbent. He's not actus purus because he's receiving this actuality from the finger of God. And it's as though an electric current is passing. That's the sense I always get from one finger to the other, like an electric current. It's the creation of the soul. So the body's about to be enlivened, by God. But here's the thing that I think is often missed in depictions or descriptions of that famous scene. So we all know about the right index finger, that's touching or about to touch the finger of Adam. But now go up the arm of God, and now go through his shoulders and go back to the other arm, which is extended in the other direction, because he's got a group of figures around him. And it stretches back, and it rests on the shoulder of a little baby. And the baby has a facial resemblance to Adam. Well, who is this figure? But Christ, the new Adam, already in the imagination of God the Father, as he creates Adam, knowing full well the fall will come, he's also indicating the new Adam, who will save the human race from its dysfunction. And there we see, in the central panel, the sort of raison d'etre of the entire composition. It's all about him. It's all about Christ, the new Adam, who will come to restore the fallen creation. I think that's the interpretive key. Once you get that, now the whole ceiling opens up. Here's just one last thing. There's so much you could say, but one last little connection. Move now from that panel through the creation of Eve and then the fall and then into the Noah scenes. Now the very last one So we've gone on this trajectory downward, if you want,
towards the altar.
Yeah, and also towards sin, because we're falling from creation through Adam and Eve into the effects of sin. Well, there we have the drunkenness of Noah. Remember the scene where Noah becomes drunk, and then he's lying naked, and his sons come in and they find him, which in the biblical context was deeply embarrassing to everyone concerned.
In the modern context as well.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. We wouldn't be thrilled about it today.
It's not something anybody wants to walk in on.
Uncover the nakedness of your father who's drunk.
Right.
But that's a symbol of like how far we've fallen. But here's the cool thing. If you line those images up, take the famous image of the creation of Adam, and now show the recumbent, nude Noah, it's like a pathetic imitation of the Adam scene. He's kind of in the pose, but old and crumpled, and the arm is not quite in the right position. It's Adam now distorted. See, Adam having fallen into degradation. Mind you, not having lost utterly the image. There it is.
Sure.
But see, in the drunken Noah, we're meant to see ourselves. That we're meant to be like Adam in this perfect spiritual state and physical state. But we've fallen into sin. But good news. Christianity never ends with that. It ends with the good news of the coming of the new Adam, who's a new David. And now look, from the David up in Florence to the Adam in the central image, that's the Christ who represents the restoration of the human race. And then, of course, if you want to keep going, on the far wall of the Sistine Chapel, so many decades later, Michelangelo paints the Last Judgment, right? Well, at the not quite the physical center, but the compositional center of it is a great figure of Christ. So there he is at the end of time, at the end of space and time. So with the ceiling, we see creation. Now, at the judgment, the end of space and time, there is Christ, who is drawing the blessed to himself as he presides over the damnation of the damned, So the whole room is about him. The whole room revolves around Jesus.
I think by this point, everyone listening, even if they haven't been living in a cave and they've never seen a Michelangelo work of art, I think everyone agree, yeah, he's a genius, he's an artistic genius, one of the greatest of all time. But how does creating artwork make him a pivotal player in the life of the church and the world at large?
Yeah, because he represents maybe at the highest pitch how the beautiful is a route of access to God. So we speak of the transcendentals, the true, the good, the beautiful. And we have a lot of our people like Aquinas and Augustine and many others who use the truth as a way. They use argument and words and all that. Other people, think of recently canonized Mother Teresa. She was the good as a route of access to God. I mean, many people won't respond much to arguments. They don't mean that much to them. But they look at someone like her and they say, yeah, I get it. I get it. She's an icon of the invisible God through her goodness. That other people, like Michelangelo, use the beautiful, right, as a route of access. Not so much arguing, not doing a Thomas Aquinas number, not goodness. I mean, I'm not going to claim great things for the goodness of Michelangelo. I mean, as a person, I think he was a decent man and all that, but I'm not going to make great claims for his personal goodness. But he used the beautiful in a way that was massively compelling, so that through his beautiful depictions, we sense the source of the beautiful, beauty itself. Now go back to Plato's Symposium, come up all the way through James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and you find this motif of the beautiful particular that opens you to the open sea of the beautiful itself. Dante stands right in the middle of that tradition, right? Hence his Beatrice, the beauty of his beloved, becomes the door that opens onto God. The beauty of his poem is a door that opens onto God. So Michelangelo, maybe to the nth degree, is someone who used that iconic route. And that's why I think he's clearly a pivotal player.
Wow, time flies when you're musing upon artwork. It's already a time for today's listener question. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, just go to askbishopbarron.com and you can easily record your question from any device. And remember what Bishop says. When it comes to theology, there's no stupid questions. Often, the simplest ones stir the pot. So let's take today's question from Sean, who wonders, how can we use the human imagination for evangelization? Let's listen to Sean.
Bishop Barron, my name is Sean from Wisconsin. Many thanks to you and your apostolate. My question is this: is the use of human imagination effective in our work of evangelization? And if so, how can we go about integrating it into our work for God? For example, how can the works of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis be used to show others the glory of Christ?
Yeah, good, Sean. I think you answered your own question, though, by evoking Tolkien and Lewis, people like that. That's what they tried to do. They tried to evangelize the imagination, which means using narrative and story in a way that bears the great story of Christ. And, you know, it doesn't have to be argument. That's one way. That's one route of access. But one thing I've discovered in my work in evangelization is you got to be flexible. And not everyone responds to the same stimuli. You know, some people are very geared to argument. They're sensitive to intellectual objections and so on. Other people are not. They're going to get at it very differently. And so I like that. And Lewis and Tolkien got it in the 20th century. And watch through the films based on their books how this is massively working. So, you know, they knew how to do it.
Well, thanks for tuning in to the Word on Fire show. I want to mention again, we've got the coupon code SISTINE4. That's SISTINE, the number 4. And then you can type that in at pivotalplayers.com for $10 off when you purchase the Pivotal Players DVD or Blu-ray. Now, this offer will only last 2 weeks, so go to the website right now and buy it so you don't miss out on this one-time deal. We'll have lots of other products there, including great study guides and prayer cards and a beautiful calendar you can purchase. So there's links to all that on the wordonfireshow.com website as well. Again, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you all back here next week on the Word on Fire show.